Good evening, I'm Savannah Kelly. Welcome to APTN National News. Reports of homeless people sheltering in emergency rooms in Montreal have been publicized over the last week, drawing attention to the lack of emergency services for the city's homeless population when temperatures plummet. Resilience Montreal has been seeing an increase in clientele, and some have been seeking refuge by sleeping in the hallways of the day shelter. Executive Director David Chapman says homelessness is increasing, specifically among the Indigenous population. But without more emergency resources, some are forced to use more creative ways to stay warm.
You would not believe how many homeless are quietly sleeping in airport waiting areas. Yes, emergency rooms, obviously metros, but others get sick of being disturbed, and so they get more creative. They go down under the ground in city infrastructure, they go into abandoned buildings, they go into further forested corners where they hide with like a tarp that's the right color for the season, like white for winter and brown for fall, green for summer, and just because they're sick of getting removed from their little space of safety.
A new report shows the shocking scale of the homelessness crisis. More than 80,000 people were living on the streets last year, according to a study by the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. The AMO says there's been a 25% increase in people living in shelters or on the streets compared to 2 years ago. The association says a surge in refugees and asylum seekers has put pressure on the system.
But it's not just about immigration and refugee and asylum seekers. It's really the product of what we think is decades of provincial policy decisions in areas like income security, mental health and addictions, as well as deeply affordable housing capacity.
The study authors warn that without significant intervention, homelessness could double in the next decade and could climb to nearly 300,000 people in the event of an economic downturn. A heartbreaking update in the search for a missing 50-year-old man from Beardy's and Okimesas Cree Nation. The Saskatchewan RCMP, Sturgeon Lake First Nation, Prince Albert Grand Council, family and friends have officially called off the search for Orlando Okimesam after he was found deceased. Okimesam was last seen on Christmas Day at Sturgeon Lake First Nation, where his remains were found. The RCMP issued a press release yesterday but did not disclose the cause of death or timing of his discovery, but they did say that the circumstances are not considered suspicious. The Saskatchewan Coroner's Service is now handling the investigation to determine the cause, date, and time of death. A new report this week reveals that the Alberta Energy Regulator recorded 514 tailings pond spills at oil sites across the province from 2014 to 2023, which averages one spill a week. Kevin Timoney from Treeline Ecological Research received the data with a Freedom of Information request. In it, he found that the Alberta Energy Regulator underreported the size of spills, including one spill that was recorded as 44 million litres, but the spill was actually 100 times larger at 4.4 billion litres. He says he was told by the regulator that the error was due to the spreadsheet not being able to fit the size of the correct number. He says the 514 reported spills were vastly underreported and that the regulator did not inspect 96% of spills.
The Alberta regulator, including the CEO, has maintained that they do routine inspections and that there's nothing that really escapes their notice. Well, routine inspections does not really tell the story when they're only inspecting a fraction more than 3% of the spills.
While President-elect Donald Trump has his sights set on drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, it seems no one else is interested. On Wednesday, the U.S. Department of Interior announced a federally mandated oil and gas lease sale within the refuge received 0 bidders. As Sarah Connors tells us, the sales flop is great news for those who want to see the refuge protected.
The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Northeast Alaska is home to over 19 million acres of pristine habitat for polar bears, musk oxen, and other wildlife. But a federally mandated lease sale earlier this week saw 400,000 acres of the refuge's untouched wilderness up for grabs for oil and gas development. No bidders came forward by Monday's deadline.
We're excited and we're happy and we're pleased. I think it's good for us right now. Decisions that have been made.
The Vuntag-Gwitchin First Nation in northern Yukon is breathing a sigh of relief. That's because the Arctic Refuge's coastal plain serves as vital calving grounds for the porcupine caribou herd. The Gwitchin in northern Canada and Alaska call the plain the sacred place where life begins.
Any development on the coastal plain will have devastating impact on the caribou and our inherent rights and human rights as Gwitchin people.
But during the last days of Trump's first presidency in 2021, he finalized a plan to open the refuge to oil and gas development. That sale generated only 1% of what was promised, and the few leases sold were later scrapped.
It shows that Arctic Refuge drilling's bad business.
This environmental group says the lack of interest speaks volumes.
It's not the way of the future, and smart companies are staying back.
But the sale's failure doesn't mean the refuge is safe just yet. The state of Alaska is suing the Department of Interior about the amount of land for sale, claiming it was too small and therefore unattractive to industry. If successful, the lawsuit could open the door for Trump to redo the sale. Motoro says Trump may also very well try to push new legislation to open the refuge to development once he takes office. But there's also a chance that could backfire.
That would be pretty wild since the first two were a complete disaster with no one showing up. I just think the handwriting is pretty much on the wall at this point. The Arctic Refuge is not a place that should be an oil field, and industry will stay away.
Wednesday's sale was the second of two mandated under Trump's 2017 Tax Act. The president-elect takes office on January 20th. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
We want to hear what you think about oil and gas development in wildlife areas or any other story you see here tonight. Here's how to continue the conversation. If you have a story you want to share, send us an email to news@aptn.ca. To read and watch our stories, go to aptnnews.ca. You can find us online on your favorite social media sites, including TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. Join APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. Trudeau's resignation as Prime Minister and U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's return to power. What could it all mean for Indigenous peoples here in Canada? Our Truth in Politics panel is here to discuss all that and more after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to APTN National News and our first Truth in Politics panel of 2025. It's shaping up to be a rowdy year in politics with the fall of Justin Trudeau and likely the Liberal government. His resignation has sparked a leadership race with a federal election on the horizon. Joining us now to get into all of this is Pasqua Strategy's Jennifer Leywitz and Winnipeg Free Press columnist Neegan Sinclair. Well, Jennifer, Justin Trudeau is stepping down as soon a new leader of the Liberal Party of Canada is to be picked, elected, found. Two-part question for you. Who's going to replace Justin, and how does this all affect the next general election?
I think as of right now, we don't know who is going to replace him. It's been pretty slow coming with people announcing who is actually running for the leadership. I think we already know that there's some potential frontrunners: Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland, Anita Anand, potentially. Melanie Joly said that is not off the table. And there was one MP who already announced his leadership bid today. So I think in the next few days, it'll be easier to answer that question once we know who's going to be putting their names forward.
And what's your take on all of this, Neegan? Who's to replace Justin, and will it mean a sure victory for Pierre Poilievre no matter who gets in?
Well, it's pretty risky, I think, for anyone who wants to take the helm. They've got to be willing to do exactly what Justin Trudeau did, which is to basically build the party back up from the ground up. It's something, the fundraising needs to be rebuilt, their relationships need to be rebuilt. The reality is that this Liberal Party is in deep tatters because of the kind of long-standing stay that Justin Trudeau had, a very successful stay. I mean, he is, for First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples, the most progressive prime minister in history, but he's also the only prime minister really to care, and so therefore the bar is really low. I think he's done some important things, certainly a platform, but whoever takes the helm of the leadership of the Liberal Party is really going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting and be in it for a marathon, not a sprint.
For sure. There's legislation possibly being swept off the table now that Parliament's been prorogued until March. What does that mean for the First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit, the organizations that represent them? Jennifer, I'll send that question your way.
I think right now, as we look at nations that are still, heavily impacted by the Indian Act and are still heavily impacted by government and its ability to function, absolutely, when government is prorogued or there's elections or there's changes in government, that inevitably has its effects on nations and even organizations across the country. Right now, I would say one of the biggest pieces of the legislation that impacts First Nations is the water legislation, Bill C-61. And that water legislation hasn't even hit the third reading yet. So, as you know, once government prorogues, everything dies on the order paper and needs to be reintroduced. Well, if we have a new government incoming and then potentially a Poilievre government, what does that mean for the protection of waterways in Canada and the sovereignty and the autonomy over water? So I think a lot of nations will be asking that question about Bill C-61. What happens next, and what does a Poilievre government look like should that need to be reintroduced?
And Neegan, what are all these groups going to do if the Conservatives come back to power, notwithstanding another minority government with the New Democrats holding the balance of power?
Well, we don't have to look too far back to know that a Conservative government, if that's true, and the polling suggests that it is, a Conservative government has a much different agenda, isn't quite as interested in opening up conversations on rights, isn't as interested as opening up conversations on restoration of, for instance, First Nations policing, or building up areas involving dealing with the issue of murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls. They're much more interested in economic issues, particularly resource management, resource negotiations. We only have to look back to Stephen Harper to see that there wasn't a whole lot of interest in protecting waterways, for what Jennifer spoke about before. In fact, Stephen Harper's government removed much of the protection of waterways, which led to the Idle No More movement, which had a cacophony, a resistance movement that was so big in First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities. It actually led to the incoming government of Justin Trudeau. And so the cycle begins over and over again for First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples. It really doesn't matter often who is in the federal government. It's always, whether it's one thing or another, we're often treated as kind of political pawns to be played within the federal Liberal or Conservative movements.
Another big topic of conversation in the political sphere is the Donald Trump factor. Jennifer, what do you make of his claims that the U.S. is open to using economic force to take over Canada?
You know, we've been seeing a lot from Donald Trump over the last little bit, especially as he's, on his way to the White House in a couple of weeks. And I'm seeing a lot of takes from conservatives that I actually heavily disagree with, and I think are also undermining what conservatives actually view as conservatism. We've seen multiple leaders speak out that, we are not the 51st state. And there's people saying, oh, well, Donald Trump is just kidding. He's just joking around. I don't really find it funny. I don't think, undermining a country's sovereignty on a national stage is anything to laugh about. But at the same time, typically conservatives value things like stronger borders, self-reliance, sovereignty for their nation, a lot like when it comes to First Nations and our sovereignty. But at the same time, he's making jokes about that. And we're seeing a lot of conservatives, at the end of the day, unfortunately being hypocrites in this scenario. And I think right now, more than ever, we need strong leadership. I just asked on X yesterday which political leaders have been at the forefront to actually speak to the media. And I know, obviously, Justin Trudeau had announced that he plans to resign, so we saw him there. Jagmeet Singh apparently did a virtual press conference, but where is Pierre Poilievre right now? And where are some of our premiers? Because right now, more than ever, we need to see that leadership out of our elected political leaders. And all I've been seeing is posts on X from Pierre Poilievre, and haven't seen much out of my premier in Saskatchewan either. So I'm just curious what's happening next.
Mm-hmm. And same question to you, Niigaan. What do you make of these claims by President-elect Donald Trump?
What Donald Trump does is he floats an idea that he is musing about, that he is just mulling over, and it could be something fantastical, crazy, but if it gets political traction, meaning if it is something that he sees that can get popular support and often monetarily support, money, then he starts to pursue it. He's seen that he can pick up some populistic support by talking about Canada as a 51st state. Same thing could be said about Greenland. Same thing could be said about the Panama Canal. Same thing could be said about renaming the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America. Now, whether Donald Trump picks up on these ideas is going to be very difficult. Legislatively, it's almost impossible to do all of those things that I just mentioned, because he would need the massive support of Congress, of the Senate, and while the Republicans do hold the measure of control, not all people in the Republican Party would support the annexation, the theft, the invasion of Canada, and all of those other places, or even just the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico. So what Donald Trump does is he starts to see if there's political support to do it. And then what he will do is he will float that idea as a form of distraction to be able to create and therefore do other things that are seen and get much less attention. So whether this idea will be something he takes up seriously, who knows? Probably not, but it's much more interesting to see the things that happen in and around when he floats these ideas than it is the actual idea itself. It's a very kind of truthiness world that we live in which the facts may not be always what he says, but also what he's doing behind the facts.
Absolutely. And Jennifer, how would a U.S. takeover of Canada affect the treaties if it were to happen? They were signed with Great Britain and not the Americans.
I think that's a piece that a lot of Canadians maybe aren't aware of or don't understand, is those treaties are agreements between nation to nation. We are our own sovereign people. We are our own sovereign nation. I'm the fifth great-grandchild of Charles Pratt. He was there as an interpreter during Treaty 4. And this goes back, some of it before Canada even existed as a country. So I think there's a lot of undermining. And when you're undermining Canada and you're undermining our relationship with the Crown, you're also undermining the treaties and the treaty people that exist. And we are all treaty people. And I think that there's that separate relationship that people are not fully grasping of. We are not just First Nations people existing under Canada. We are First Nations people existing with Canada.
For sure. And with Trudeau's resignation and Trump's return to power, the future of Canada-US relations appears uncertain. Niigaan, what do you think the next few years have in store on that front?
Well, I just want to add to one thing that Jennifer talked about in terms of Indigenous rights under Donald Trump. If anything, Donald Trump has proven time and time again in his various appearances at Congress, his struggles for casinos, even his short term as president the first time around, is that he's absolutely against the issue or the ability of First Nations, tribal communities to have rights. And so this is absolutely something you want to keep an eye on, especially when it comes to resource management. What the next few years are going to look like are going to be undoubtedly contentious. The question will be is whether a forthcoming prime minister, who likely will be Pierre Poilievre, if the polling suggests, and also whether Pierre Poilievre has a majority or a minority mandate. That will dictate whether this is a contentious time between Canada-U.S. relations. But the real question is, will Pierre Poilievre stand up for Canada for premiers who will likely demand him to do so, or will those premiers separate on their own to advocate in their own bodies? Will we see much more contentiousness between the provinces and the federal government over the issue of U.S. engagement with Canada? Because as we're seeing right now, all of the premiers are lining up to defend provincial sovereignty. The ones that are coming out, certainly the premier here in Manitoba, Premier Canoe, has said that their Manitoba speaks for Manitobans, and we are not interested in any ways being taken over by the United States. There's certainly going to be more of that coming. Doug Ford is now seeming to be the champion of talking about provincial sovereignty. So if that's going to continue, we're going to see a real big split or a question of whether the provincial and the federal government will be aligned on dealing with the United States. That's the contentiousness I'm interested much more in.
Absolutely. Great conversations on these topics, and it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds. We're only 1 week into 2025, so there's definitely going to be more on both of these topics. Jennifer and Egon, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining us today to talk about this stuff, and we'll see you next week for more Truth in Politics. We have much more on Trudeau's resignation coming up on tonight's episode of Nation to Nation. We'll bring you a preview when we come back. Stick around. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Michelle found herself locking eyes with this little wagish, or fox, near Nipissing First Nation and was able to take this stunning photo. Thanks for sharing that one with all of us. If you have a photo you would like to share, send your photos to share@aptn.ca. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, 2 degrees and snowy for Charlottetown and Halifax. Nain, -3, Kuujjuaq, -5. Saguenay, snowy and -4, Quebec City, 0 degrees. Ottawa, sunshine and -6, Sault Ste. Marie, -3. Timmins, snowy, -7, Thunder Bay, -6. Churchill, -24 and snowy there, God's Lake, -20. -14 for Winnipeg, -12 in Dauphin. Yorkton, snowy, -7, Saskatoon, -4. Stony Rapids, snowy and -22, Meadow Lake, -2. Snow and -24 for Fort Chip, Peace River, -6. Calgary, mix of sun and clouds, 6 degrees there, same for Lethbridge. Penticton, snowy and 2 degrees, Canal, +2. Prince George, rainy and 2 degrees, Dease Lake, snowy and +4. Watson Lake, snowy and -7, Mayo, -6. Wrigley, -15, mix of sun and cloud there, snowy and -23 for Yellowknife. Paulatuck, -14, Colville Lake, -13. Baker Lake, snowy, -20, Nauyat, -18. Snowy and -15 for Iqaluit, Igloolik, -19. Now here's Fraser Needham to tell us what's ahead on this week's episode of Nation to Nation.
Coming up after the news, it's been quite a week in Ottawa after Justin Trudeau's announcement. He'll be stepping down as Prime Minister once a new Liberal leader is in place. Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu is here to talk about why the government is moving forward to negotiate a deal on long-term reform in child welfare with First Nations in Ontario. AFN Regional Chief for Ontario, Abram Benedict, is also here to tell us why the Chiefs of Ontario support this move. And we also talked to Toronto Metropolitan University Professor Pam Palmater about what the Trudeau legacy may be when it comes to Indigenous people. All this ahead on Nation to Nation.
And you can catch Nation to Nation coming up here right after the news. That's all the time we have for your Thursday news on APTN National News. For news anytime, head over to our website at aptnnews.ca. I'm Savannah Kelly. Marcy Miigwech, thank you for joining us tonight. Have a great night.